obviously organized crime is bad.
Yeah. Let's be clear on that, guys.
Completely unambiguously. Yeah. But it is a very, I guess, an interesting source to see how do people operate in these environments where they have very few resources, at least initially, and they have very heavy constraints on how they're able to operate and how they're able to communicate.
What is up, creative critters? It's your boy Eugene Choi.
Hey, I'm Jonathan.
Hey, and it's Michael.
And welcome to the Pample Pod, the show with candid conversations and creative chaos. Welcome, listeners, to this beautiful Monday morning. And as always, we're going to go right into this week's big question, where we talk about where we have a topical and thought-provoking subject for this week. And we'll dive into Thanks, Mom after that. So the question that I want the three of us to discuss for this week would be, what can tech entrepreneurs learn from industries outside of tech? I have some other questions to ask later, but let's sit on this for a bit. I'm curious to see what you two have to say.
Yeah, there's lots to learn. I think that two points that we'll be coming back to a lot are the importance of branding and marketing. You've seen a lot of examples recently in tech where this has been done really successfully and to a lot of like financial success. And the other thing I think that is worth talking about, and it's an issue across industries, is fighting scope creep and sort of fighting ballooning costs and the implications that has for the products you make and how successful they are.
Yeah.
So, maybe I'll just, do you want to talk about the marketing branding aspect first?
No, it's an interesting one. I think you should tackle that one too. I kind of agree with you there. And I was going to say just even like, different industries that face different adversity through time too. So there's like some adaptability that goes along with that. But no, I'm curious to see where your mind is going with the marketing part.
Yeah, I think that, marketing and branding is really important for kind of the cultural pervasiveness of your company. Companies like, Coca-Cola are like, I think it's like the second most known word internationally is like Coke.
Huh.
And
I know that.
Or it was according to a study that they did, I think, during the 80s.
Interesting.
And I think the most known word was okay.
Oh yeah, which I
think spawned their OK Cola campaign, where they're like, we're going to become the most known word.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's I think a very good example of marketing and branding that's been done well in tech is sort of like Tesla and SpaceX, because they have a lot of very avid fans, people who not just, and this is true for Apple to a degree too, they have a very idiosyncratic kind of aesthetic to their designs, and they have very good kind of maintenance of what content they put out there and make sure it all fits within their brand. And because of that, you have people who really like idolize these brands and are more so like fans of the company. It might not necessarily because of like because it's like the best product out there, but it's more so because of like the hype that they're able to generate and about being able to stay relevant in the cultural consciousness that I think is so important that a lot of tech companies don't really capture. Like the kind of what people immediately think of when you say SpaceX is probably like kind of the futuristic aesthetic, like the image of like rockets being landed and then reused. And that really makes them think about like the future, and it gives like a good impression. If you mention something like, I don't know, United Launch Alliance, most people are like, what is that?
It feels old, kind of like stale-ish.
That's sort of the impression I think people in the industry would also have, if they know what United Launch Alliance is. And there's something to be said for kind of like, how that company moves slower and how they've run over like deadlines on their newest rocket. But it's also kind of like how they play to the public and how much information they kind of give away. Not even information, just how in the loop they keep like their fans.
Yeah. I think there's something interesting to be said about the word of mouth aspect too, because there's a couple of things sometimes that lead to this sort of, almost cult-like adhesion to a brand. Because, the product being a magnitude better is typically one thing that's given as like a reason why someone might love a product more than others. But when you think about just fundamentally like ULA and SpaceX, they're both rockets. Sure, one is reusable. That has been done in the past by NASA in the 60s, right? So in of itself, it's more repeatable now, but it's not a true innovation in the sense that, it's been done before. But you're taking cargo in both cases. And in a way, it's similar products, right? It's the price tag maybe is a magnitude better, but just the fundamental mode of operation, right? Both ULA and SpaceX have had delays objectively. So it's kind of murky, right? Like in terms of the magnitude improvement on the product, other than the price tag. But there is that word of mouth, and this sort of impression of SpaceX that where you took a product that, people were already somewhat familiar with. It's not, as brand new as it could have been, but it still generates this whole new enthusiasm that is almost reminiscent of like, lunar landings and stuff like that.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
the same amount of enthusiasm people have been showing.
Cultural phenomena. Exactly.
There's a certain pride, probably maybe in the country to some extent, but also like certainly in the product and just, yeah.
Maybe even a better example would be like Tesla, because rockets have always been kind of the stuff of imagination, and they've always captured like the cultural consciousness. I guess you could say that's true about cars in America too. Yeah. There's been lots of popular cars, but I think Tesla specifically like has people who are more avid fans than, if you were to try to like find people who are really into Toyotas and they're like, oh yeah, I love Toyota. Like they're really like breaking ground. It would be difficult to find that, if you would be like, oh yeah, like, it's a reliable car, but it doesn't capture the imagination in the same way.
Yeah. And that's important with, or something Tesla did really well, right? Because when you think about the time sort of pre-Tesla, you had electric cars once again, like that existed. But what's really interesting is that like, it really wasn't a glamorous thing. Less sure how it was in the US, but for example, like you had small electric cars you could have in Europe, and that's usually the car you would have if you couldn't get a driver's license. They were smaller. They were like basically below the threshold to be considered, whatever,
like
a Class A car.
They feel like a downgraded product from what people aspire to have.
Yeah, exactly. So. Whereas here, it's like they've successfully transformed them from an undesirable object to an object of desire, which is kind of interesting.
And personally, I think that's a lot of marketing. I don't think Teslas are amazing cars in a lot of ways. I think they have some shortcomings, but I think that their branding is really well done, and because of that, they're very successful.
So now, but I think that definitely does open up a question for us to think about. Is like what kind of industries outside of tech that are really good at that kind of storytelling and branding, like Jonathan, like what you're saying, these companies, even outside of tech, that can connect with customers at an emotional, fundamental, primal level.
Yeah, I have two examples that come to mind that are wildly different. I don't know if one could be called tech, but to start off there, it's video games, which in a way is still tech.
Well, tech is really broad. So I
video games are an interesting intersection though between like entertainment and tech. So I
think that counts, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's like consumer entertainment. Yeah,
I think what's cool about video games is sort of the notion of speedrunning, for example, specifically that subsegment. Because it's really taking something that's essentially a glitch usually to start with and turning it into an advantage. And I think there's something to be learned there where, usually when you have a fault in your product, there's kind of that sense of shame. You hide it, you tweak it, not unless you cover it up, but you try and do something about it. Whereas what's kind of interesting with video games and that is like you almost take pride in those glitches and you can really lean into it, and it actually ends up being a selling point and leaning into that advertising.
It's not a bug, it's a feature, guys.
No, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But it's kind of funny in a way, right? Like, but it just works out really well. And so there's something about that industry where, I don't know, maybe because probably depends on the stakes. I'm sure you couldn't do that with like medical devices, like, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Unless it maybe leads to like a happy accident. I mean, like when you think of chemistry or scientific discoveries, in many ways it was like a happy accident, so maybe that is it's not a bug, it's a feature.
No, but I certainly understand that there's certain times where you do not want bugs of any kind, or extra features as you might call them.
Yeah, but to me, like that comes to mind as like something that's kind of cool. And
and you could have like collector's editions that I'm sure there's collector items that come from like manufacturing defects, specifically in like collectibles, or
I imagine
like
they must be.
This Pokemon card like has some crazy manufacturing defect, so it's worth twice the amount of the other ones.
Yeah, I wonder if you have that on hardware. I'm sure there must be an example of like hardware where something was the defect, but it actually ended up being like a unique piece or something.
Yeah, I think certain pieces of hardware that are more easily hackable have like I think been successful for that reason, where like or more versatile, unintentionally more versatile than they were intended to be.
Before you shared the second example they had in mind, I think a great example of where a company showcases their quote unquote like faults or like defects would probably be SpaceX, where they had that reel of like failed landing attempts with their Falcon 9 on the ground, or just like the remote ocean boats on the ocean. I think maybe we could circle back to that in a bit, but that's just something that popped into my mind when you were talking about showcasing defects, or in a way turning that into something good for a company.
Yeah, no, it's a good parallel too of taking some pride and ownership in that. I think there's an interesting point with to be able to do that, you probably still need to get a product that eventually has resolved that fault.
You have to be able to move past that stage. Yeah.
If you haven't solved it, you shouldn't advertise it. You could say we have so much flight experience and we use that experience to solve this problem and we're well tested. You know, I think that's a good argument you can make with a failure reel if you've solved the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is maybe still like one notion like or shade different than like the video game part where it's like you're not fixing the fault, you're actually just owning that fault like as is, not fixing it to then advertise the sort of the path to success. But with what you said with SpaceX, it is an interesting ability to take something that historically was like you don't really showcase that, or at least not as publicly as they have, and then you just kind of put it out there, right? So that is kind of an interesting take on their marketing or advertising.
I love how we're looking at all these sort of companies, just for observation and research, and it does get me wondering what are some really unexpected sources of inspiration for innovation in tech.
Hear me out here for a second. It's outside of tech, probably not a company, but my second thought was organized crime. Because, no, but like when you think about it, like jokes aside, it's a remarkable ability to adapt to a hostile environment and be extremely decentralized, yet very resourceful from logistic. From a pure decision-making process to operate in this sort of like cellular way that's completely disconnected, yet highly... call it adaptable to different outside interventions, maybe law enforcement or others, is kind of interesting, right? Like again, I guess it is an industry of its own, not just like a single company. But granted, it's illegal and a lot of bad things happen, so not necessarily supporting that, but just from a pure organizational standpoint, it's a very interesting way that people have like this sort of resilience built in, right? Like from a company perspective, that would be something interesting to look at. The actual illegal activities aside, of course, but just from the pure organizational standpoint, and maybe also the work ethics and morals that go with it. But again, just from the decentralized approach, it's kind of interesting how resilient some of these organizations are, right? When you think about all the sort of day-to-day adversity, right? By virtue of having to operate illegally. So it's kind of an interesting feat, right? Especially if you think of like a pre-internet days, it's kind of like an interesting resolve, right?
Complex, and you think about like the number of people involved versus like the amount of money that they probably made through prohibition. I guess you could say it's much more like efficient than like a regular business would be.
Yeah,
just really, obviously, organized crime is bad.
Yeah. Let's be clear on that.
Completely unambiguously. But it is a very, I guess, an interesting source to see how do people operate in these environments where they have very few resources, at least initially, and they have very heavy constraints on how they're able to operate and how they're able to communicate. Yeah,
exactly.
Definitely can create some innovative solutions.
Alrighty. Well, I got another question in my head I wanted to ask you guys was, how do industries manage slow, methodical progress compared to tech's fail fast culture, like industries outside of tech?
I'd say tech is in something of a unique position because when you fail in tech, sometimes the stakes aren't so high. I mean, you certainly always lose money and time when you fail, regardless of the industry. But I don't think failing fast is a good principle for every industry. I think if you're, like, let's say in pharmaceuticals, I mean, you want to fail responsibly. I think regardless of industry, that when you fail, it should be at a stage where no one gets hurt and that you do so like ethically and without like compromising your morals. So I think tech is in a good position because you can fail pretty late in tech and you'll lose lots of money and lots of time. But you typically, that won't be associated with the loss of human life. So tech kind of has a unique advantage there compared to some other industries.
Yeah, I tend to think of it as like a fail efficiently more so than fail fast, just because it's, the failing fast doesn't necessarily guarantee you learn a lot or that you learn at all too. But and I was trying to think of that question from like, in industries, I guess, that move a bit slower and what do they do or what is their take on it? And there's a couple that come to mind. Architecture for one, or civil engineering, like big projects, they have a very different perspective on, buildings are built to last essentially too. So I guess that's one where it's maybe moving a little more methodically. And
I'd say that every construction project is sort of its own unique beast because the soil conditions are different, the surrounding infrastructure is different. And so there's no one size fits all solution for a lot of projects. And because of that, you have these like kind of decentralized companies. You don't have much vertical integration. It's a very different environment than how tech usually is set up.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. It's conditions are changing, and the building to last also does shift that perspective, like how serviceable something is. Like, granted, you're still on Earth, but like it's some things like on the insides, like foundations and stuff, aren't necessarily as easy to rework. And to me, that draws a parallel, for example, with how NASA tackles projects, right? Because their projects, at least current day, right, are usually deep space missions where you can't go and service that spacecraft. And it's typically, like a decade-long mission. So, I mean, it depends on the mission, but like typically on that sort of scale where it does shift your perspective on how you build. And so I think to some extent that also explains why NASA has more of those pre-mortems, trying to think ahead, like how can we design, anticipate, think through design and testing. You don't necessarily have the luxury of bringing the rocket back and refurbishing it like SpaceX might. And so it's, I know it's kind of easy to criticize, NASA sometimes for moving slower, but they do have a very different perspective, kind of like architecture does, where if you go on a different orbit, it's a different radiation, a different solar exposure, different thermal cycling and stuff like that. And so I think, that kind of what you're doing, how serviceable it is and how, I guess it needs to endure in time, probably to me is one of those things that endure or generates that slow and methodical approach. Even with like Japanese companies, for example, like the Kairitsu, it's a lot more about intergenerational knowledge and slow and steady progress, sort of with that mentality of building through times. But you have companies that are very enduring, typically too. And spread across a really interestingly large, diversified portfolio of activities. So I think in some cases it makes sense to be less fail fast and more methodical too, if depending on that product and what the objective is there. But yeah, especially if you're early in bootstrapping and you need to make like a magnitude difference, I can see the moving fast being, because that's your competitive edge, right? Like you don't necessarily have the same resources to allocate. And so
you have less momentum, you can change your path more easily.
I really want to dive deeper into, I think something you mentioned before, Jonathan, about failing responsibly. And Michael, you had a lot of great inputs on that. Are there any companies that come to your guys' mind that have experienced something like that?
I think.
And how have they hopefully recovered from something like that?
I guess drawing from my engineering ethics class a little bit, I think Ford is kind of famous for choosing to fail and choosing not to solve certain problems. Specifically, like the Ford Pinto is a very famous example of engineering ethics, where Ford essentially found out that the placement of their gas tank on cars was causing fires, and that was like directly contributing to the loss of human life. And they wrote a report on it, and they basically said, how much money would it cost to pay lawsuits, and how much money would it cost to install a plate on all the cars to stop this issue from happening? And they decided it was cheaper to just pay the lawsuits.
Wow.
And that certainly did not do much for consumer trust in the company. And I guess how that actually relates to the difference between like making methodical process and failing responsibly is like, that's a case where obviously they should have caught it earlier in the design, but when they actually reach that point, it's taking a slower methodical process can also help like generate that trust and communicate to your consumers that you know what you're doing, and that I guess in their case though, they thought about it slowly, methodically, and then they made the wrong decision. So that's also a possibility for what you can do, which you should not.
That's full fail safe there.
That's like hopefully that's like the worst example. That's like, wow.
They did basically
that's a crazy wrong. Story.
And they also did something where they basically rushed to market by repurposing an older car that had a propensity to flip over. And they like repurposed it into an SUV so they could like meet the new trend that they saw. And it was financially successful. Absolutely. But they decided to like kind of put quickly iterating over resolving fundamental issues that had built up in the foundation of their design. So
I feel like that reminds me of like what's going on with Boeing with all the planes and the disasters and everything. Like they have traveled work with their airliners in the factory up in Seattle, and just like they have issues that have not been resolved while they're building these planes, but they just have to keep progress moving forward. And at some point the plane just leaves the manufacturing facility with those unfinished designs, and then you had the whole door blown off in the flight and just things like that. It's crazy.
Well, the thing too with Boeing is like historically they were an engineering first company that did have good products, but I think over time the sort of stakeholders and priorities might have shifted. And I was going to say, like to your example with Ford in general, things like road safety or aviation safety, even with like parts 131 for different mandatory inspections and stuff like that, or even the EPA too. That's kind of the safeguards for companies that don't necessarily put the user first and have made this sort of calculation of lawsuit versus revenue.
And that's part of the danger of letting certain companies self-certify. For example, like the Boeing 737 mats, Boeing was able to certify their own design to the FAA, and there's some pretty like well documented problems with the put the nose down system on that.
Yeah.
The MCAS.
All right. On that note, hopefully we can move to a brighter note
topic.
Hopefully.
with our Thanks Mom segment, where we talk to ChatGPT to ask her to provide us 2 random prompts to ideate around in terms of a product or venture. So hopefully Mom does not give us something depressing or difficult.
Can't promise. I feel like between the sort of self-certification and the organized crime, we're on a roll today.
Yeah, let's get something light and airy for the Thanks Mom segment, please.
Yep. All right, Mom.
Change this Monday around.
This one will be interesting. You guys ready?
Let's go for it.
Whisper Anvil.
One is seem light and the other
Whisper Anvil.
Wow,
Yeah.
they cancel out.
Well,
The contrast goes crazy here.
well.
I'm just thinking of like a really quiet drone that just comes in with an explosive payload now.
This reminds me of like this could be like a contrast to the Thunder Stapler, where
Oh,
Thunder
yeah.
Stapler was something really loud. Whisper Anvil is something that's just
Very quiet.
or maybe like Shadow Blenders as well. Something
Oh
really
yes,
quiet.
this does remind me of the Shadow Blender escapades.
That was a funny episode.
Well, when it comes to the Whisper Anvil, when I think about an anvil, the first thing I think about is metalworking. You know, like being able to, use an anvil to like shape, for example, like a sword, or to hammer out like horseshoes. So maybe it's a quieter, more material efficient way to mold metal. I mean, right now it seems like injection molding of metal or like casting is very popular, which works well. Maybe a Whisper Anvil would be some way to perform metallurgy on the go, either in a more compact form factor or more energy efficient.
Yeah, I'm struggling more with this one today, but I'm thinking like Anvil, for example, just to kind of put some brainstorming out there for lack of a more substantial contribution. Either pinning something, like I guess you would pin the metal against that back support. So essentially like a strong back support or back brace, maybe like thinking more bringing structural strength or bringing maybe rigidity to the system.
Like a rib, maybe.
Yeah, it could be like a rib, or it could be like also even almost like an exoskeleton comes to mind, something like that, like maybe a quiet exoskeleton that doesn't have like a ton of noise from moving parts, but that would be like an anvil in the sense that it provides that sort of back support. So less so in the more literal, like, hammering on that object, but more so just like I think of a very sturdy and dense kind of object there.
Yeah.
Almost like you have like diamond tips, right? And like extremely hard material.
I wonder if we can try to abstract this beyond the typical.
Perhaps one way to abstract it is to think about the anvil as in like the metaphorical like hammer and anvil. So specifically like the military tactic where you have like one force that's like basically like pinning down a group, and then you have another that's like actually doing the striking. So I guess in that sort of mental framing, a Whisper Anvil would be some sort of like quiet way to keep an enemy in a certain position. So maybe it's like some sort of drone that like flies over there quietly and then like jams their communication, so they don't necessarily know that there's like another attack incoming. It's just like very local jamming.
Yeah.
That you can kind of place where you want to be, that we can kind of keep a group in a certain area.
I could see Whisper Anvil being a great defense tech company name, because I'm thinking of most Greek mythology and think of Zeus like, making his lightning bolts on an anvil or something, and that could be like you have a Skunk Works, for example, or Shadow Works or something like that.
It does
Whisper Anvil is
it does lean
nefarious
really
name.
nicely with the word whispered, because you want to keep it stealth and quiet.
Yeah,
away
but
from the public eye.
Anvil still has that impact, or kind of like you said, like sort of that sort of hammer and anvil kind of application to it.
It could also maybe be a like defensive sort of work or technology if we're thinking about like the defense side, like defensive and like the common everyday meaning of the word, like to help with defense. Just trying to think of how that would be accomplished.
I'm trying to think of whisper as in like, I'm thinking of like rather than a one-on-one whisper, like a sort of a room of whispers. This is maybe a stretch of the imagination here, but I'm almost thinking of defense and maybe taking it more electronically to like cybersecurity. Like I'm almost thinking of like almost, I'm kind of combining with our previous big question there. So it's a big stretch of the imagination, but almost like you have mutual insurance, where you got multiple people sort of joining in for some insurance purposes. That, but from a cybersecurity perspective, basically many people banding together for some kind of like, say, cyber defense platform where they're able to communicate all together, almost like a group-led sort of cyber software, where, as I guess, many people buy in, and then if things are going well, I guess, maybe you get some dividend back or something on good times.
So it's like cybersecurity insurance, maybe, or like
less so insurance, like the model, like of how you pay into it, almost like a mutual insurance, but an actual what's the word I'm looking for? Like a community funded software.
I see. So it's like an open, not necessarily open source, but like
like you pay into it. So it's still sort of Whisper, and like you buy into the community, but you sort of have this like sort of widespread network where you can like spread information fast on different attacks that people are subject to. Sort of this mesh network.
I see.
Of Whispers that allows you to spread knowledge of novel attacks fast to prep the anvil that would be your defense and sort of your block. Something like you pay into it, for example, and if times are good, and maybe you can like just like mutual insurance, like give some money back too, but you still have some kind of paying fee. So it's like group led with some flexibility. Like if things are going well, you benefit from it, I guess cash wise, and if it's not going well, then you benefit from the defense aspect. And so it's a stretch.
It's an interesting idea.
Very interesting idea.
Think about some challenges. I mean, unlike traditional defense, getting more people together sometimes makes cybersecurity less secure.
Yeah.
That's an interesting paradoxical trait. The more people who like know about a system or are familiar with it, like the less secure it usually is. And you also, like a lot of walled garden systems, like for example, the phone network system is like a walled garden. So you need to be very careful about not letting potential adversaries into the system.
Yeah.
Because then if it's like relatively free once you're within, then it opens you up to a lot of attacks, like what you're seeing with telecom infrastructure.
For sure. That's where some controlled buy-in might be a little, some kind of middle ground too, where, like you said, it's not purely out there either, just because you have to be careful.
And then again, some of the most secure platforms, I don't know if I'd say most secure, but there's some very secure platforms that are completely open source because the code's been very rigorously vetted by an enormous number of developers. And that if there is an error, then it'll, be found by like all these communities that are looking for it. Yeah.
I could see how Whisper Anvil, riding off of your idea, Jonathan, could be some really secure defense telecom network, because Whisper is just something audible, and then Anvil, it's not manufacturing, but Anvil just gives you the impression that something is sturdy, solid, reliable. So maybe I could even extend to some sort of communication like network system out on the field, even
communication platform. I see.
Yeah, could be like both the hardware and the software. Maybe it could be a laser comm thing, for example, because I would imagine that compared to just, I don't know, any other traditional system may appear more quiet. Leaning into the Whisper part.
Because if you're transmitting, like let's say radio frequencies, that can definitely be picked up. And even if it can't be decrypted, you can still tell that like a signal is being sent, and you can probably figure out where it's coming from.
Right.
And nowadays, I think that kind of satellite services or Starlink is sort of in vogue for defense communications, at least for getting service out in the field. So it'd be interesting to see if there's a more like subtle way to communicate that's more difficult to pick up on. So not only more difficult to intercept, but to even know that the communication is occurring.
Yeah. That's an interesting idea too. Yeah.
Even like even going back to like, what do you call it? Like how optical fiber is being used more for drones. It could be like a physical, like hardline system that's like out in the field where you'd have to figure out how are you deploying it effectively and like keeping it open as people are moving around. But it could be a useful way to like communicate stealthily.
Yeah. Certainly, at least for the need, call it, of the opportunity space, it's pretty well established need. That still has a lot of
communication is certainly like the essence of like modern warfare.
Yeah, and interception that goes with, or the jamming especially too, like sort of that command over spectrum is increasingly problematic. Whether it's because you are locating people you shouldn't, if you're thinking like drone operator, or just intercepting communications. So.
For some reason, my head was just going to like an anchor for a ship, just because I was thinking of the word anvil, something heavy.
Fair.
I don't think it really gets you anywhere with an anchor, though.
Hey, some anchor bit designs are better than others, Some I was watching a video not so long ago on like 10 different types of anchors and their ability to actually, like sort of dig in and actually prevent the ship from moving. Because anchors move, and that can cause damage if they slip when they shouldn't.
Boats are heavy and they have lots of drag on them, so the
That's
anchor
true,
needs to hold its.
And the more they drag, the more they just kind of rip things off the bottom of the seafloor. So it could be a real quiet anchor.
Mm-hmm.
Can bring back the pet rock with like a pet anvil.
And it whispers to you at night from the corner of the room. You're like,
problematic.
You wake up, you're like, did you hear anything? And the anvil's like, go back to sleep.
It doesn't sound discomforting at all.
You got to tie in both words somehow.
Yeah, if we had a metallurgy expert in the room, maybe they might be able to give their 2 cents or something.
Mm-hmm. I've seen, I know that there's maybe mobile like molding kits. For example, if you break part of something, like let's say, like you have like a drone and like one of the spokes that holds like the propeller breaks. Mm-hmm. And what you could do is you could maybe use like a mobile molding kit to like make an impression of the part you need to replace. And then use some type of metal that has a low melting point to like melt it down and then cast it and then like replace the parts somehow.
I could see that going well with the sort of discussion we had on 3D printing, or at least like a mobile kit, essentially. Mm-hmm. You have the anvil, which is the building. It's not as
versatile as the 3D printing, but it's,
Yeah, but you got the anvil, which is the building part, and the whisper, which might be the light and travel part of it too. Because like, I mean, there is maybe a legitimate point to, if you need to do field repairs on things, if you're remote with a drone or some other type of, maybe even other types of vehicle.
Yeah, you can't bring a mill and a lathe and a CNC machine with you.
You don't bring that on your travels.
So I think molding is probably the most compact form of metallurgy you could do for like manufacturing metal parts in the field. Compared to maybe a Dremel, it depends on like how.
I do wonder if there is value to having some tactical soldering kit, especially if you're out in the field. Maybe your electronics,
like a welding kit or a soldering kit.
Soldering kit, like something just that, like on a smaller scale. I wonder if there is value to having something like that out in the field, especially if you have like an electrical engineer out in the field. Maybe if you're on a boat, for example, or something. Now I think about it, I do wonder, would it be possible to just mount like a Navy ship with a 3D printer or like a lathe, just in
3D
case?
3D print more planes,
or even just like what if there's
if that was.
What if there's a hull? What if there's a breach in the hull? Maybe a enemy submarine attacks the hull of a ship. Mm-hmm. What would you do if you're the Navy? How would you repair the? Mm-hmm. What would you do? So I do wonder, what if you had like a 3D printer or something that can fabricate something on the spot? Yeah. And maybe it should be quiet so that submarines can't pick up the sound of the machine actually operating in the hull of the ship, so to speak. So you can keep the fact that you have a manufacturing machine a secret from the enemy.
Yeah, I'm thinking, because you do have machine shops on ships, like the bigger ships, right? Mm-hmm. I guess if you're already spotted and someone's already shot at you, maybe you don't. Yeah. But I wonder if you could build like a small barrier or like even a landmine or something, like build whatever your defense is quietly, like you're building it in situ. Mm-hmm. Now, can it be on the ship, not in the sea, directly in the water?
Yeah, maybe it would be some sort of like underwater robot or like submarine of your own that can like repair the damage to the hull while it's underwater. That's a very difficult problem to solve.
Yeah.
But, I would go back to the welding. It would just be underwater welding now.
Yeah, and it would need to be relatively fast too, I guess.
Yeah, but I can see a circumstance where maybe like your ship was hit by a torpedo and you flooded some of your ballasts, and you have like some for redundancy, of course. And then like the enemy went away or got like scared off or got destroyed, and now you want to make repairs so that if in the future you're attacked again, you have that margin again, and you're not just like, at lower health, so to speak.
Yeah. Like, if you've sectioned off, for example, some, whatever section is being flooded.
Yeah, you could then
maybe pump it
back out. And pump it out, and you'd be back to kind of where you started.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah.
That'd be interesting. It'd be sort of like an underwater welding robot.
Like a health doctor for your ships.
Yeah, it could also maybe even extrude like metal filament. Though, of course, in the water, it's probably very difficult to keep it up at the right temperature.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting challenge too. Like direct underwater welding too. Definitely a defense case for it too. I think commercial might be a bit of a...
Might be easier just to drive back to the dock and get
build it outside and then drop it back in or something with a crane boat or something.
And maybe metal's not the best material for that. Maybe there's something else that you could use to repair it.
Yeah, interesting thought.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we could wrap this segment up and the overall episode. If anyone has any interesting ideas that they want to share for Whisper Anvil, please put it in the comments. As always, we are always looking at the comments and would love to shout you out on the next episode if you have something awesome to share. And if you have any input for this week's episode about what tech entrepreneurs can learn outside of tech, please share it as well. We would love to hear other sources of inspo that may have inspired you, the listener, and things for us to think about in the future. And yeah, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
See you in the next one.